It started almost 100 years ago at 90 miles an hour. The beginning of America's love affair with the car. It was about speed and a rich man's dream. Fiercely competitive and willing to risk his life, handsome, dark-haired Willie K. Vanderbilt set out to be the fastest man on Earth.
Willie K. was easily the most ardent automobilist of the turn of the century. Had he not been so enormously wealthy, I'm sure he would have been a mechanic, because he loved machinery, and he certainly knew more about machinery than most of the rich who had cars.
When Vanderbilt began his love affair, only the rich could afford these newfangled machines. Most didn't care how they worked. They simply collected them like toys, and could well afford to. It was an era of incredible wealth. Vanderbilt was the son of the richest man in America. Although he never worked a day in his life, he could tune his own engines, change his own tires. His love of cars had begun in childhood with a ride on a steam-powered tricycle. At 22, he bought a Phoenix Daimler that set him back $10,000. Then there was the car that terrified every pedestrian in New York. The Mercedes racer he named the Red Devil.
Vanderbilt scandalized upper-class New York with his adventures in automobiles, frequent accidents, races in city streets, drunken escapades with young ladies in the back of the car.
He just wanted to drive and to race and to challenge anything that was challengeable.
Once he even took on his own railroad, the New York Central. Driving 60 miles an hour, he ran neck and neck with the train from Newport to Boston. He would have won if he hadn't been stopped for speeding. In 1904, at Ormond Beach, Florida, driving a Mercedes, he set a new land speed record of 92 miles per hour, proving once and for all that Willie K. Vanderbilt was the fastest man on Earth.
Interestingly, the man he beat was someone who very much wanted to win, not like Willie K. for the sport of it, but for its commercial aspects, because he was determined to become an automobile manufacturer. That man's name was Henry Ford.
While Vanderbilt was breaking records in foreign-built cars, the typical American car was just a buggy with a motor strapped on it. Vanderbilt set out to change all that.
The big, powerful, sophisticated cars were being made in Europe, not in this country. And Willie K. wanted to do something about this. So he inaugurated the first serious international motor contest in this country.
With typical modesty, he called the race the Vanderbilt Cup. The first prize, a trophy designed by Tiffany's, and $20,000 cash. The 300-mile race was held on Long Island, just outside New York City.
The spectacle is one of speed, power, and wealth, often attracting crowds estimated as large as 350,000, 400,000. They were probably the largest audiences ever attracted for an American sporting event.
It was a spectacular event. Nobody in this country had seen the likes of sophisticated automobile racers who came from overseas to do it. So they stormed onto the track just to get a better look at the racers. They didn't realize how dangerous it could be. Willie K. had to call off the race because he was afraid another of the cars coming toward the finish line might hurt somebody.
Every year, the crowds grew larger and more rowdy. The race became a day for hard drinking and hard driving, and claimed more than its share of casualties. A Vanderbilt Cup racer was a raw machine. Overpowered and underbraked, it was an accident waiting to happen. The cars rode so rough that drivers were beaten black and blue and lost 7 to 8 pounds in the course of one race. Cutthroat, they thought nothing of throwing wrenches or a handful of bolts to slow down the competition. In 1908, after 3 years of racing, the American car finally came into its own. George Robertson beat all comers in a locomobile made in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Willie Kay had proved the American automobile the equal of any in the world. The results, he said, far surpassed anything I had anticipated.
Willie Kay planted the seeds of the automobile in this country, not only by introducing the very rich to the automobile, but introducing it to the larger populace as well.
America was now ready to give the Europeans a run for their money. Maxwell, Rambler, Pierce Arrow, Locomobile, and Packard all beefed up their engines to compete. Every mechanic who ever tinkered with an engine seemed to be going into the car business. Along with Henry Ford, there were the Dodge brothers, Louis Chevrolet, and Henry Leland of Cadillac. In the next 15 years, over 3,000 people would try automobile manufacturing. And across America, it seemed like every small town had someone crazy about cars. Even a farming community like Oregon, Illinois. Here, E.D. Etnier decided to get into the business of making cars. His grandson, Joby Etnier, remembers.
Well, starting in 1907, Grandfather built 3 of the horseless carriages. And then they built a dozen of what was known as a touring car. These old Etniers had a 4th gear in them. You had to be going at least 45 miles an hour to get into 4th gear, and I don't know where they found the roads to do that. Of course, they wore the goggles, the dusters, because there were no paved roads. They were fast.
As a small town, Oregon's life was much like many of the other small towns in the U.S. When the auto arrived, of course, the streets were already being used by horses and buggies. Along comes this contraption with a motor, trying to occupy the same space on the streets. You can probably imagine that there were some difficulties.
Farmer Marvin Jacobs remembers his family's first encounters with these devil wagons.
When the automobile first came, I think it caused more problems because of the runaway of the horses. Noise of the cars was something new to the farmers as well as the townspeople. Of course, horses was in the majority, so they had the most laws in favor of the horse rather than the auto.
There really were some bizarre laws. One of them, for instance, required that there be a horseman preceding the vehicle and that he carry a Roman candle. And he, in a sense, was the warning of the forthcoming vehicle.
One of my favorites was if an automobile scared the horse and carriage. The automobilist had to dismantle the automobile, put all of its parts alongside the road, and allow the horse and carriage to pass, and then he could put his car back together again.
The car was slow to catch on with country folk, who still preferred their horsepower on the hoof. There were laws against driving on the Sabbath, laws against using a car in a funeral procession, laws against motoring into town without phoning ahead. Old Dobbin was certainly cheaper. He never ran out of gas, and he could always find his own way home.
The roads back then were very bad. In the summertime, they were either muddy or dusty, and in the wintertime, they were either frozen rough or else they were packed full of snow. So it was very seldom whether you could say the roads were good in those days.
Farmers began to see opportunity in the motorist's misfortune, as Russell Poole recalls.
In the spring, there was a bad spot on the road. A neighbor of ours kept his team of horses all ready, and someone would come along, he'd pull them out. An uncle of mine got stuck there one time, and he charged him $5 to pull him out. He was quite put out about that.
People who were living in rural America really had to be convinced of the fact the automobile would be an advantage. In particular, they had to be convinced that it had some advantages over horse-drawn vehicles, or just over the horse itself. And so what needed to be proven was that the vehicle was reliable, could be counted on to function when you wanted it to function, with a minimum number of repairs.
That was a tall order. Auto manufacturing remained a risky proposition for some time. In the town of Oregon, E.D. Etnier, who had dreamt Detroit-sized dreams, went bust after making only 15 cars. To prove that American cars were practical machines, rugged enough to handle rough country roads, a rich Bostonian named Charles Glidden organized the first reliability run, an endurance test called the Glidden Tour. In 1905, thousands gathered on the sidewalks of New York as the 33 contestants cranked up for an almost 900-mile tour from Fifth Avenue to the White Mountains of New Hampshire and back. The driver with the fewest repairs would win. It was automotive history in the making. On the starting line, J.D. Maxwell in his 8-horsepower Maxwell Runabout. Ransom Eli Olds, the inventor of the Mary Oldsmobile, and Percy Pierce in his elegant Pierce Great Arrow. For the next 8 days, the drivers negotiated rough roads, crossed streams, and climbed mountains that would give even cars of today a hard time. Scaling New Hampshire's Mount Washington was the ultimate challenge. An 8-mile, gear-crunching, radiator-busting climb to the clouds. The only woman among the contestants was Joan Newton Cuneo, a wealthy matron who drove with remarkable skill. She entered the tour in a white steamer she'd owned for just a week. The first day out, she was forced off a bridge by another car. Within an hour, she was back on the road. But her luck wouldn't hold out. Engine trouble would dog her for the rest of the tour. But at the finish line, 10 cars came through with perfect scores. And the most perfect of all was Percy Pierce's Great Arrow, made in Buffalo, New York. Charles Glidden's confidence in American cars had paid off. At the back of the pack, Joan Cuneo finally limped in. But undaunted, she began turning up at races from New England to New Orleans, competing against well-known drivers like Barney Oldfield.
By 1909, she's regularly beating men racing drivers, and that was the year she beat the guy to beat. She beat Ralph De Palma, who was the most celebrated male racing driver in the United States. That same year, the AAA banned women from organized automobile racing. And they asked her, are you trying to prove something about women? Are you trying to drive this car so women can get the vote or get more rights? And she said, no, I'm really not the women's rights type. I've never been the suffrage type. I just like to drive fast.
Driven by the novelty of speed, Americans had fallen in love with the car. This was one affair that was going to last. By 1909, the car was becoming a familiar sight. About 125,000 were sold that year. Aggressively named the Viking, the Rocket, the Dragon, the Sharp Arrow, most of these cars were sold to men. the world of driving was all but closed to women.
There was a long tradition that women didn't know how to manage machines. And let's remember that these were probably, for most Americans, the biggest, most powerful, most scary, most potentially liberating machines that there were.
Even as a passenger, there were hazards. Flying stones, soot, oil. It became fashionable to look like you were dressed for battle.
A woman who was dressed for motoring would be wearing a chin-to-toe coat of some kind. Often they were made of rubber. Then there would be a heavy veil, and some of these veils looked like they were armor. They made people who were wearing them look like Darth Vader.
Colonel Albert Pope, a bicycle manufacturer, saw a future in making cars that even a lady could handle. A car that was clean and simple. A quiet little electric car. Powered by rechargeable batteries, the electric car would start with a press of a button. With no cranks to turn, without any gears to shift, they were easy to maneuver, as Murtis McKee remembers.
The electric cars didn't go very fast. About as fast as you could walk, I guess. Bessie Baker and Mrs. Finch rode uptown in this car every Saturday night and took in the music, and then I guess they rode home again. And they drove on the sidewalk.
Electric cars could only run for about 25 miles without recharging. So women had to stay close to home, which is, after all, where most men wanted them. In 1909, a 22-year-old housewife named Alice Ramsey would thumb her nose at tradition and set out to do what no woman and few men had ever attempted: drive 3,800 miles across the United States, when most roads were only wagon trails. Alice Ramsey was still driving at the age of 89.
These young people think that they get a little smarty cat, you know, and they sneak in because they think it'll frighten somebody. Well, that's not my idea of good driving. They may be fast, but sooner or later they're going to catch it.
Alice's driving career began in Hackensack, New Jersey, when her husband, Congressman John Bone Ramsey, bought her a gasoline-powered Maxwell. Her son, the Reverend John Ramsey, remembers the story.
My father didn't like cars except to ride in them. He always used to say, "How do you stop this contraption?" But Mother had learned to handle a car, apparently, in 2 lessons, which was a bit surprising to everybody, I think, including her.
Within months, Alice was racing. She even beat Joan Cuneo in 2 long-distance events.
She took manual training in school at a time when mostly boys did it. When she was a girl, it was quite unusual. She ate it up. And I think if she hadn't had that early experience and assurance, she would never set out on that trip.
She was a natural, a rare combination of elegance, moxie, and mechanical skill. Alice soon caught the attention of the Maxwell Motor Car Company.
Maxwell people came to her and said, "We've never seen a woman handle a car as effectively as you do. Would you be interested, in the interest of selling Maxwell cars, to drive one for us across the continent?" She was quite excited at the thought of doing such a thing.
In her journal, Alice would write,
"I was flabbergasted by the proposition. This was a challenge. I broached the subject with my husband. He said, 'Well, if Nettie and Maggie want to go with you, I'm willing.'"
The chaperones were my father's 2 sisters, Maggie, Nettie, and a young friend, Hermione Johns. Nettie and Maggie were so remote from anything to do with any machinery or anything. They never did any housework. Nettie never did any work of any sort in her life. I'm sure it was a humorous trip. Aunt Nettie sitting erect in command of the situation. You'd have thought she was driving, but she wasn't.
June 9, 1909, New York City. Alice's big day. The start of a long journey west. There was a lot at stake. Not only the reputation of the Maxwell Company, but the safety and the lives of the 4 women. When men stepped forward to crank the car, Alice grabbed the crank and announced, "We'll get ourselves started." With chains on the back wheels for traction, they clanked up Broadway. Of the 4, Alice was the only one who knew how to drive.
They followed what was later called the Lincoln Highway, which was in some places just grass roads, some places mud, in some places unmarked altogether. They didn't have maps. They had what they call blue books. It said, go about 5 miles to a green house with white trim and make a right turn, or to a red barn and make a left turn. The trouble was with that, by the time you got there, they might have painted the barn a different color and you were misled.
We had to find our way mostly by the telephone poles. And we could usually suppose that the ones with the more wires went to the larger town. We thought that was good common sense. Once or twice we got mistaken.
The weather held, and after crossing a third of the continent in just 14 days, they arrived in Chicago. The trip had been easier than expected. But just to be safe, they loaded up with a tow rope, block and tackle, and a small shovel before heading west across the Mississippi. They had been warned about Iowa.
What a basin of mud. 360 miles of gumbo. The black, heavy clay in which horses were known to drown.
The whole main street of a town would be flooded. They were in so deep that they couldn't move up to the hubcaps. They had to abandon the car, wait for farm wagons to come and rescue them and get them to a hotel with their baggage.
Iowa locals pressured Alice to give up, to put the Maxwell on a flat car and ship it across the state. But Alice was determined to drive every inch of the way, she said, even if it kills me.
After the rains, the roads were horrible. We plowed along, forced to keep the transmission in low gear. The water boiled, got low, and needed replenishing.
Nettie and Maggie unpacked fancy glass bottles from their luggage, rolled up their sleeves, and scooped up water from the side of the road. They called it Operation Cut Glass. With no corner gas stations to turn to, when the Maxwell's electrical system began acting up, Alice was on her own.
She had trouble with the distributor and apparently fixed it using some chewing gum. Just what she did, I've never been sure, but the car ran at least for a while. That's the kind of ingenuity, though, she had.
Following the route of the overland stage, they crossed Nebraska and headed into Wyoming. West of Laramie, more trouble. The bridge across the North Platte River had been swept away. The women had 2 choices: a major detour that would cost days, or a route that would risk their lives, driving across the railroad trestle at Fort Steele. Alice, true to form, chose the dangerous route.
Time was precious. I lived one bump at a time. It was one of those places that you didn't look down. We had to cross the bridge before the next train came barreling through.
Safe on the other side, The women were still going strong. But after 34 days on the road, the Maxwell was beginning to show the strain. The tires were blowing out one by one, and there were still 1,200 miles of mountains and desert to go.
On a couple of occasions, they had to spend the night on the road because the car broke down and they were too far from towns to walk. They were bothered with wolves a couple of times, trying to get at any food that they might have.
The campfire kept the wolves at bay, but in the desert south of the Great Salt Lake, another creature would bring the trip to a crashing halt.
A prairie dog had chosen to build his front door right in the wagon tracks where we were traveling. When we hit this yawning hole, the front wheels were spread wide apart and certainly had no intention of working together in harmony again.
Alice tied the axle together with a roll of baling wire. It wasn't pretty, but it would have to last until she could get to a blacksmith at a nearby ranch. Between repairs and driving in the desert heat, the women were on the road for 17 hours, heading for the high country that stood between them and California.
There was a great unspoken tenseness in this final lap. The Sierra Range confronted us with sudden steepness. As we started to climb the crest, the carburetor was feeling the altitude, but the engine kept on pulling.
59 days after leaving New York, a triumphant Alice Ramsey pulled into San Francisco. A cavalcade of cars escorted Alice and her 3 companions through the city.
People waved and cheered as we drove up Market Street. There were more Chinese than we've ever seen in one place. What a day, what a journey. From Hell's Gate to Golden Gate.
Alice's gamble had paid off. Now the Maxwell Company would promote their car as gentle enough for a well-brought-up lady to drive and rugged enough to conquer a continent. For the rest of her life, Alice Ramsey would drive across the country at least once a year. The Model T, high, narrow, and downright homely. Part of the American family. A people's car. An automobile for every man. More than any other force on earth, it would transform the American landscape and the way we lived our lives.
It put America on wheels. Instead of spending all your life on the farm, you actually got into town and, in fact, traveled around other states. Everybody loved the automobile in America. The love affair started with Model T and it never stopped.
It was the inspiration of Henry Ford, a man who had grown up in the Midwest. He hated school, hated farming, hated the isolation of rural life. In 1896, he built his first car. A self-taught machinist and engineer, he founded the Ford Motor Company in 1903. He was 40 years old. By 1914, his moving assembly line was producing almost half the cars in America. Soon, Ford was making over 1,600 cars a day. The price? Only $490.
You could buy about 4 or 5 Model Ts for the price of a Packard. Packard probably cost as much as a farm.
When dealers were presented with brochures of the car, even before they had seen it, they marveled that they would have such a car to sell. People liked it, in many cases, in the same way they liked a horse, and they gave them nicknames, Old Betsy or Liz.
Tough and durable, Lizzie could really perform. Putting out 20 horsepower. On a good day, the T could hit 40 miles per hour. With a wheelbase only 100 inches long, it could turn on a dime.
It was the Model T more than any other vehicle which really caught the farmer's fancy. It required a minimum number of repairs. The engine itself was very simple. Farmers had had experience with gasoline engines before, and so they were able to keep their car up themselves.
You got a toolkit with the car, you got the jack and the tire pump and wrenches, a screwdriver, and an oil can, and most anyone could fix these cars.
No air conditioning, no power steering, no power brakes, or you could pretty much fix anything that went wrong with them.
A radiator sometimes got holes in it. The farmers would just take a raw egg, pour the contents of that raw egg into the radiator, and the heat of the water would basically boil the egg into where the holes were in the radiator and seal them. A car that was capable of being repaired that way had a great deal of appeal to the farmer.
The Model T was easy to keep running, but not always easy to start.
There was a real process to get a car started in the wintertime. And it was mostly due to the oil in them that was so heavy. They used 40 and 50 grade weight oil.
One time, one of the neighbors couldn't get it started, so he took the oil in the house and he put it in the oven, and I don't know whether he forgot or got warm too quick or what, it exploded and burned the house down, and they had to build a new house. So I think everybody learned from that to take it out fast.
Back in the 1900s, in rural America, life was often hard and lonely. In places like Oregon, Illinois, the car would prove a godsend.
When I was young, we went with horse and buggy. It would take the better part of a half a day to go and do your shopping. I remember going many times with my mother into town, but we didn't go that often because it was an effort.
People who'd scarce dreamed of an auto just 5 years before were now discovering how the car would change their lives. No one ever forgot their first drive. Hazel McCourt was 12 years old.
He said, "You want to ride?" Well, I had never ridden in a car before. And I says, "Do I want to ride?" I says, "I sure do." He had a two-seater, but he had the top down. And that was better yet. We got in there. He took us down to the depot, which was a mile away. Boy, was that I never will forget it. The wind was just beautiful.
Once in a while, we'd ride with my dad up to Grandma's, see, and we'd stand up in the back seat. I can't imagine. We stood on the floor in the back, and we'd say, "Go fast, Pa, go fast." And he'd step on it a little. Oh, we just giggled. We thought that was great.
Farmers were rather creative in their use of automobiles. They did not see them as purely means of passenger conveyance. And as a result of that, frequently the cars themselves were modified in various ways. An incredible number of devices were put on the market which used the axle as a means of power to drive some other mechanism.
Cars were used to saw wood, grind grain, even run a washing machine.
My dad used to haul everything in the car, in the back seat, even newborn calves, and it'd be kind of a mess. Once in a while, my mother would complain. She always had to clean it out, but she was pretty good about it.
For many rural women, the car promised escape.
It was a tremendous freedom for the farm woman who spent her life toiling, not 5 days a week, but 6, but 7 days a week in that farm. And when they went into town, that was freedom, really freedom for that lady.
Well, you could go, go places without depending on somebody to take you, a man to take you. And that was quite a privilege. Just take a ride, get out of the house. Yeah, women years ago, they never even got out of the house.
What Henry Ford had in mind when he invented the Model T was every man's car, and he meant that quite literally. What ended up happening, however, was that a lot of rural women said when they got a hold of that Model T, this is my ticket to anywhere I want to go. And so the Model T considerably lessened the isolation and really the dreariness of rural life in the United States.
By 1915, even in small towns, the car was commonplace. 1 million Model Ts had now been sold. Out in the country, the Model T was better than most negotiating the rutted roads. But sometimes, the roads were even more than Lizzie could handle. Joy Fischel remembers.
Daddy started home to Nebraska City in his Model T Ford, and it had rained and rained and rained, and the mud was so thick you couldn't walk in it, and of course up in that direction you've got this old what they call gumbo. And it's kind of like driving in about 6 inches of axle grease. And it built up so much under the fenders on his car that he actually couldn't turn the wheels. So he tore the fenders off the car and threw them in the ditch and went on home.
It was clear to Henry Ford that business would bog down unless he got the Model T out of the mud. To sell the country on building new roads, he launched an extraordinary publicity campaign.
Henry Ford felt that motion pictures would be an important medium for educating the public. So in 1914, he set up the best equipped motion picture studio in the country. Not even Hollywood had anything to equal it in those early days. And he began producing a series, a weekly series called the Ford Animated Weekly, which we would think of today as a newsreel.
Seen by 5 million people, Ford's films featured farm trucks speeding to market on smooth paved roads, children riding to school on paved roads. Suddenly, little towns across America were in the road business. And there was even talk of a superhighway.
The idea was to have a coast-to-coast highway, and they chose the name Lincoln Highway. Soon, this town and that town wanted to be part of the Lincoln Highway, and they had a really curious way to get people interested. They built something called a seedling mile. They plant a little seed by taking a stretch of old, dilapidated, rutted, foul, impassable road, and they'd lay down what was then the prettiest ribbon of highway you've ever seen, a wonderful mile-long strip of concrete. And so the early automobilists would eventually poke their way along and up onto this new ribbon of highway, and suddenly the car came alive, and the 20th century was born, and that addiction to the car was instilled, and the foot went on the accelerator, and the landscape picked up speed in the windshield, and they glided along that seedling mile, but just for a mile, and then back down in the mud, sloshing along to the next town. The nearest seedling mile to Oregon was about 30 miles away. The effect of the Lincoln Highway was exactly as the founders of the Lincoln Highway Association hoped. People went to this section, they then came back and they said, we here in Ogle County, we here in Oregon, ought to begin doing things with the roads as the Lincoln Highway had done.
Paved roads had a funny habit of turning up in front of rich men's houses.
We had Governor Loudon living here, and there was a Loudon Road because he had that paved with tar all the way out to his house. So when we went for a ride, we went out the Loudon Road.
Paving roads was a very expensive process. And so just after World War I, the state highway officials all got together and said, we really want to pave roads, but the federal government's going to have to help us do it. And that was the beginning then of the National Highway Movement.
Americans now had more cars than bathtubs. But with our newfound freedom came traffic jams and smog and children running for safety. Everything about our lives was changing.
And the changes were so great that it's almost unheard of in American history. There probably is not another invention which has had such a singular impact on the daily life of average citizens.
We went on picnics with that first car. My mother'd pack a picnic lunch on Sunday, and we'd go out and drive around, you know. One time we drove clear up to Wisconsin and ate across the line so we could say we'd been in Wisconsin.
It created a whole new dimension of life, both for the adults and also for the youth.
Of course. Yeah, family life changed quite a lot. The boys would have their cars and they'd go out. I went with a fellow from Mount Morris. He had a car, and he'd come down, and we wouldn't stay in the house like we used to, or on the porch, and we'd go to Dixon, generally go to Dixon. That was a big deal.
We went to Rockford. It rained real hard while we were up there, so we stayed there all night. And you know, it hadn't even rained hard down here, and I'll tell you, we had a real hard time explaining that to our folks when we got home.
And that was a radical change. During the 1920s, a teenager can simply hop into the car and go out at night, go into town to see a movie or to do something else. And you began to see the emergence of a separate teenage world, if you will, that was separate from the world of their parents.
The automobile moves courtship off the front porch and into the back seat. And this is something that a lot of ink will be spilled over in the 1920s. Moralists associated with Prohibition, associated with bans on jazz music, also are writing about the automobile as the third leg in the triumvirate of hell. There is dancing and jazz music, there is alcohol, and then there's the automobile.
There's always been the rumor that Henry Ford would not build his cars beyond a certain width or provide seats beyond a certain width because of his concern about lovemaking in automobiles. But as some wag once pointed out, given the Model T's 7-foot height, short couples could make love standing up.
Ford set out to sell America on wholesome vacations in the great outdoors. In a series of well-publicized excursions, he went camping with his chums, President Warren Harding and Thomas Edison. Americans were fascinated by the elite roughing it in their white shirts and ties.
Henry Ford became a folk hero because many people looked at Henry Ford and felt they were just like Ford, except that he had $1 billion and they didn't.
As the country's first great tour director, Ford now lured Americans to all the exotic places in the national parks. Like road gypsies, ingenious campers turned their Model Ts into a home away from home, setting up wherever the spirit moved them. No expensive hotels, no overpriced restaurants.
We just never had too much money, so we stayed in a roadside somewhere. We had a tent. And that old Model T Ford had the running boards. Mother had an old boiler that you used to boil your clothes. She filled that up with food, and that was on the side of the car. She was a goer. She loved to go.
In the 1920s, people would leave the farm and actually go somewhere, see some of the scenery in the nation.
Howard Fox and his family would leave Kansas and go touring every winter.
If you were a wheat farmer and you sold your livestock, you didn't have a whole lot to do in the wintertime. So my dad would take the family out to California and come back and harvest his crop in the spring.
In the 1920s, the automobile really becomes king in the United States. The automobile seemed to symbolize so much the what's American about us, in the sense of the wide open spaces and mobility. And the automobile almost became the substitute for the horse. As you would ride off into the sunset, when the wind is in your hair and your elbow is out the window, it's a completely different feeling.
The Model T put this country on wheels, and it was that car which took America out of the mud and made it as mobile as it would become. It's hard to think of any product which has done more to change the culture of this country than the Model T.
By the mid-1920s, Henry Ford had the satisfaction of knowing that over half the cars in the world were Model Ts. But out in California, with its palm trees and fabulous weather, Lizzie would be forced to compete with a high style of custom-bodied sedans and low-slung roadsters. What no one understood, not even Ford, was that the Model T's days were now numbered.